All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with bite.
Did you ever hear the story of the boy who cried wolf?
It's done in America all the time.
Factitious disorder imposed on another, also known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy or induced illness, is a psychological disorder in caregivers marked by dysfunctional response to an apparent addiction to the attention one receives for providing care to someone with afflictions or infirmities. The person with this disorder gains further attention by seeking medical help for exaggerated or made-up symptoms apparently suffered by his or her charge. In some cases, this can extend to surreptitiously acting out against the person in order to exaggerate existing care needs or create new ones the caregiver can use to continue the cycle of attention received from acting as the long-suffering supporter and the psychological feedback that creates. This is the case in some instances of child abuse and is well enough known to have occasionally been represented in pop culture. One example being the little girl in Sixth Sense who dies after her mother puts cleaning fluid in her food to make her sick. The story implies that this has been going on for some time, happened to her grandfather before her, and will be done to her younger sibling after she is gone. The reason her ghost manifests to seek help. Some of the issues which can identify the caregiver of a patient as a case like this are medical problems that do not respond normally to treatment, take an unusual course that does not make sense, present highly unusual lab results, or are impossible. One symptom which can identify a case like this is when the patient's caregiver is abusive toward others, even professionals, who question things about the patient's condition, symptom pattern, or medical history that do not make sense. Another is when the caregiver seems upset, rather than relieved, when the patient's symptoms reduce and it looks like the attention feed might be cut off. This can result in a frenzy of increased abuse of the patient, the bait, or of those from whom that reward feed comes, medical practitioners treating the patient, or even friends and family who have provided support. Compare this to feminism's behavior toward women, especially in the area of intimate partner and sexual violence. They view women as the patient, men as the disease, abuses as the symptoms, and government action in the form of financial support for feminist caregivers, and legislative and policy change as the treatment and attention or reward feed. To obtain this, feminist academics and organizations have done the same thing to women's experiences that caregivers with factitious disorder imposed on another due to their charges. They exaggerate or even outright fabricate issues, often genderless issues which they've also falsely gendered, upon which to demand an ever-increasing, ever-widening scope of more of that reward feed in women's name. This has resulted in other similar symptoms to this disorder as well. For instance, feminist intimate partner and sexual violence prevalence research was not designed to obtain factual information about the rate of abuses experienced by women or the rate of perpetration by men, but instead to exaggerate both as much as possible, resulting in data that does not make sense when compared to people's real-life experiences. This data is used by feminists as lobbying fodder for legislation to increase government intervention in citizens' lives on women's behalf, usually through government-funded feminist overseers and facilitators, with the resulting discrimination against men supposedly justified by presuming them the disease that the legislation is needed to treat. The patient, women, or in this instance women's personal safety, has not improved due to the treatment measures taken in response to this data, but continually worsens. Yet feminists become irate if any of the data is questioned or any other course of action is suggested. Instead, they insist on continuing to pile on more legislative government interventions to be similarly overseen by interdisciplinary studies majors and other feminist-trained professionals whose compensation must also be government-funded because it's just so very important. To maintain this demand, they have spun tales of female fear and pain, misogyny, discrimination, and oppression. The patient population consists of second-class citizens, they say, living in a world in which their bodies are viewed as public property and their rights unrecognized. There is, we're told, an epidemic of gender violence which only feminists know how to address. And if you don't believe them, you hate women! In fact, any contradiction from the public or any members of the patient population must be dealt with severely because it is a threat to feminism's reward feed. You, John Q. Public, must not question the narrative ever. You must not suggest that the patient population is not the only population experiencing these issues, or that the disease population is not the only population of perpetrators. Under no circumstances may you note the fact that things are improving, or that the supposed caregiver continually moves the goalposts to define more and more ordinary interactions as symptomatic of this so-called epidemic in order to keep the public's panic afloat. Point out that attitudes, beliefs, and activism of the supposed caregivers themselves are causes for the increase in evidence of said epidemic, and you face the pimp hand of a challenged ego. And it's been working, until very recently, on university campuses. Every instance of female suffering, manufactured or real, has resulted in the creation of jobs for feminist ideologues willing to generalize the individual's experiences to the entire population, and put responsibility for remedy upon the government. Every symptom academic feminists can manufacture has resulted in legislative change in which the government seeks to micromanage some form of student interaction, usually resulting in increased regulation via expansion of Title IX, and from there the expansion of those manufactured jobs, and even entire professional areas. The result? A veritable army of emotional vampires who make their living whoring out female students as proxy victims at the expense of male students, civil rights in general, and through your government's funding, you. Eventually, of course, feminism's imposition of factitious disorder on women hit critical mass, becoming too much for the public to not question. As victims of the dysfunctional system feminists created began seeking help through the courts, the true nature of the disease has become undeniable. As we saw in our last discussion, in the face of over 200 lawsuits against universities acting on their advice and abiding by policy and laws for which they lobbied, the supposed caregivers are scrambling for control. How did things get so bad? The same way they do in deadly cases of Munchausen's disorder by proxy. Slowly, incrementally, with each step a test for the tolerance of the patient and any observers before the next is taken, and the next, and the next. And there will always be a next step until the sufferer, or rather the perpetrator, is caught or the patient is destroyed. A presentation by Rowen University Title IX Conference keynote speaker Laura L. Dunn, Esquire, provides a look into that process from the perspective of a patient-turned-caregiver. Tonight, on HBR Talk, we'll begin examining her speech. Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 49, Title IX, Feminist Munchausen's by Proxy. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, and our undercover badger, Andrew, who has, once again, infiltrated academia cleverly disguised as himself, to continue discussing his observations from the recent Title IX Research and Resources Conference at Rowen University. Today, we have audio from the conference, and we'll be listening to and commenting on that. But we will have something else to get to first before that. But, before all of it, we still have a shill. If you're on YouTube and it starts experiencing platform malfunction syndrome and won't let you listen, remember we're also on Twitch and Facebook because you can't keep a good badger down. And if you want to be sure you'll always be able to catch our live streams, even if YouTube decides to throw us in the gulag for Ronthink, where one of our channels always is, well, then you better get down to badgerfeed.com again and register to receive notifications. Same thing if you want to catch our show in its audio format, or if you just want to really thwart Google's efforts to get rid of our line of thinking. And if you want to do that, don't forget to like and share this video and other Honey Badger live streams. So, now to breaking news. I believe, Andrew, you have a write-up for this part.
Yes. So recently, yesterday, the New York Times somehow managed to get a leaked draft of Betsy DeVos's Department of Education proposed Title IX regulations last year. If we all remember, they rescinded, to the dismay of many, to the great surprise, honestly, of a few, that they rescinded the 2011 Obama administration Dear Colleague letter on the grounds that it was not properly put into place because there was no review period, essentially, is the grounds that they had to remove it. So interim measures were put in place last year. That was the 27 Interim Guidance. And now we have a look into what the Department of Education may be proposing for new rules and regulations. So just a few things. So this is a leak. It's not the final version. However, we'll probably be seeing similar provisions to it in the future because this is mirrors a lot of what the interim guidance is. So schools can choose between two standards: preponderance of evidence and clear convincing. That was in the interim guidance. That's going to carry forward. However, a school, if they, for example, use preponderance of evidence for all their other disciplinary standards, it must apply in the sexual assault misconduct standard as well. So it can't have two different systems of evidence, essentially. Also, mediation was introduced in the 2017 interim guidance. It wasn't in the 2011 Dear Colleague letter guidance, so it's something that was originally removed in that, but now it's being added back in. Mediation is the form of informal resolution. We talked about this last week when we were examining the presentation from the two lawyers. These new rules will allow for complainants and respondents to actually cross-examine each other in a meaningful way. Previously, schools were basically allowed to say, no, you're not allowed to ask the other party questions. It wasn't, the New York Times article wasn't specific as to whether or not it had to be an in-person thing or not. Some schools don't actually have in-person hearings for determining guilt or innocence. So if it was in that type of setting, I would assume that cross-examination in person would be allowed. However, if there's other systems that schools use, it's rather unclear. Regarding evidence, the school must provide all evidence gathered in an investigation to the students, whether or not the evidence will be used in a hearing. So that means everything: exculpatory, inculpatory. The students can't be hidden from any evidence that an investigator may gather. Sexual harassment would be defined as unwelcome conduct on the basis of sex that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it denies a person access to the school's education program or activity. This is a much narrower definition than the Obama guidelines, which defined sexual harassment as unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, so this guidance is much more specific. Schools can remove an accused student from campus after a safety and risk assessment. This is something that existed before. Basically, if there's something like the student has a weapon or something, or they're proven to be a danger to the campus, they can be removed. Schools are only legally responsible for investigating complaints that are official reports, and where school officials have an actual knowledge. Actual knowledge means that somebody reported it to a person that can take corrective action. So a Title IX official. Previously, some schools had provisions where if an RA or some other type of designated person was made aware of a complaint, they were forced to make a report to somebody above them. So that could get rid of that or discourage schools from using that. A new standard of deliberately indifferent for whether or not to hold schools responsible for not investigating based on only if it's quote, only if its response to the sexual harassment is clearly unreasonable in light of known circumstances. So this makes it so that schools are not as responsible for if they don't know something, they can't be held accountable for something that they didn't know about. Schools are only responsible for investigating something that happened on their campus or within one of their programs. Something that happened at an off-campus apartment, for instance, would not need to be investigated by the school. Previously, schools were required to investigate no matter where the event took place. So if it involved a student at all, they were forced to investigate. So yeah, that was rather interesting. Schools would not be penalized for providing supportive measures to accusers who do not file a formal complaint. These measures are encouraged to be non-disciplinary, individualized services, and non-punitive, time-limited, and narrowly tailored. From the New York Times article, quote, the rules provide an extensive list of options such as counseling, deadline extensions, changing class schedules, campus escort services, mutual restrictions on contact between the parties, changes in housing, leaves of absences, or increased security and monitoring, end quote. So basically say, okay, if the person doesn't file an actual complaint, you can still help them in other ways, as long as it basically doesn't impact the person that they would have been accusing. Regulations go to great length about stressing impartiality investigations. They should be, quote, prompt and equitable, end quote. They also say that the mistreatment of the accused could count as sex discrimination explicitly in this draft of the guidance, which is very big, in my opinion. And finally, the regulations, the new regulations, the draft of them, state that all investigations should start under the presumption of innocence. It's also big having that as well, because if we've heard from some of the lawyers last week where they ran into investigators where they presumed innocence, so something like this being written in guidance is very good. And that's basically it.
Yeah, the nice thing about this is actually it looks like a lot of this is the same stuff that was the advice from those two attorneys that we talked about. Like she's basically giving the schools the options to follow that advice and to handle these things more evenly, and to still be able to, if somebody says they're a victim, to still be able to take measures to protect and serve the victim, but not necessarily punish anybody if the person doesn't come forward and say, I want to make a complaint. Right. These are all good measures because it creates a incentive for the schools to handle things a little with respect to the human rights of both parties involved, and not to railroad everybody that gets accused of anything.
Yeah. So a lot of this was guidance that was issued in the 2017 Interim Guidance that's just being carried forward. So none of this is really too much of a surprise. But
a lot of it seems to correct some of the rather egregious overreaches that they previously had.
Correct. Like one of the things that was in the Obama era 2011 Dear Colleague Guidance was that sexual harassment was defined very broadly. Is just the, quote, unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. They said specifically that this 2017 guidance is following the Supreme Court decision of some kind, where it had to be the unwelcome conduct on the basis of sex that's so severe, pervasive, objectively offensive that it denies a person access to school's education program activity. And harassment is a thing that occurs over time. It's not just one instance.
Well, among other things, if something's not interfering with your education, if you're just annoyed by it, then it's not something that somebody else should be punished for, and it's not something that should necessarily be handled as a disciplinary matter by the environment that you're in. That's just dumb, honestly. I mean, people should learn by the time they're 12 to deal with things that are mildly annoying, or things that they just don't like. Somebody breathes wrong next to them in the classroom, or somebody spoke to them on the way to and from the like the dining hall or whatever, that's not harassment, and they just need to learn to deal with the fact that they're in a social environment, and that not everybody is going to socialize the same way they do. And until somebody does something that is outright abusive, you know, then there's not a reason for anything to be handled punitively. There's certainly not a reason for there to be an authoritative response at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's interesting. Well, I'm curious as to how far away we'll be seeing these regulations potentially put in place. And we'll see if maybe Congress decides to fight back on something, but I don't know how well that would go, because it'd be curious, because right now the political landscape is interesting.
It's very interesting. I think it might actually result, if Congress attacks repairs to due process rights on university campuses, those involved they're gonna end up seeing problems getting reelected. Definitely, that's gonna piss people off. And I actually, you know, thinking about it, that might have been the goal. I mean, this is the New York Times that published this, right? So
yeah, they somehow got access to a draft of the what's it called? The proposed regulations.
Proposed regulations, yeah. So the New York Times is a very progressive-leaning. It's not left-leaning. It's regressive, progressive-leaning publication. Yes. And I'm wondering if someone in the education department who is also progressive-leaning released this information and got it published in the New York Times with the idea of maybe galvanizing the feminist student community and the academic feminist community, the professors and so on, the feminist lobbying movement, groups like the National Organization for Women, to start contacting their congressmen, start contacting their senators, and demanding that this be put on a back burner or eliminated altogether, because it's going to supposedly hurt women, right? Because now they can't just accuse and point the finger and get some guy thrown off campus. They actually have to be able to back up what they're saying somewhat. And now they can't drag somebody who's not really sure she has been assaulted, or harassed, into the university Title IX office and nag her into filing a complaint and have it go all the way through to getting some guy thrown off campus. So that's going to be problematic for them.
Yeah.
But the answer to that is, if we start seeing these proposed, if we start seeing news about these being proposed, and the mainstream press probably will not say a lot about it unless they are trying to combat it. It's going to be
I haven't seen any other mainstream media report on it. It's just been smaller blogs and stuff that have been pissed
talking
off
about it. Right, but it's going to be on us to turn around and contact our congressmen and our senators and say, hey, this is very important. Due process is very important. This is about the ability of all of the students to be able to attend university campuses without thinking that they are in a Gestapo situation where the secret police are going to come and take them away, and so there has to be an even-handed response, and this is a good description of an even-handed response. But does anybody have any other points to make on this? This is just the sort of the beginning, where we haven't even gotten into the sound file yet.
No, I think it's obviously good news. Like, people who say, oh, it's just getting worse and worse. It's like, well, not always. Like, in some places, they're starting to fight back against this stuff, which I think is really encouraging.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I'll be curious as to when a lawsuit will be filed against this, because people have already filed lawsuits against the 2011 guidance being rescinded, as this particular speaker mentions in her speech at some point. I forget when, because it's a very long one. I'm curious as to when they're gonna, if they're gonna just sue the day that these regulations are actually attempted to be put in.
Sorry, I can't have a show without a technical. Like, all right. SciTube is apparently in a hurry to go on without us.
Oh wait, what?
I'm sorry. I thought that's why you hesitated because it started playing, and I'm like, no.
No, I don't have any other comments.
Okay, sorry about that. All right. Well, in that case, we are going to skip forward a little bit because, well, there's an intro. Actually, you know what? I think the intro had some things in it I thought were interesting. We're not going to finish this sound file. It was the way she was described. It might not be a bad idea to listen to that.
Okay, that's fair.
So we'll go ahead and start with the intro. So now there's not going to be any video to go with this, and I didn't come up with a bunch of images to go with it. So you'll just have to deal with our animated faces, guys. Here is the audio of Laura Dunn, the keynote speaker from the Title IX conference
at Rowen University.
Program today, and I have the pleasure. My name is Joanne Connor. I'm the President's Chief of Staff, and I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote for this afternoon. Laura L. Dunn Esquire is a nationally recognized victim-turned-victims' right attorney whose work has been featured by HBO Vice, National Law Journal, People Magazine, Rolling Stone Magazine, The New York Times, MSNBC, Washington Post, and Time Magazine, among many others. In 2007, Dunn graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a BA in Legal Studies and Psychology, as well as a certificate in criminal justice. While a student, 2 men from her crew team sexually assaulted Dunn. Despite reporting to campus officials and police, she was denied justice and eventually filed a Title IX complaint against the University of Wisconsin. Her experience with campus sexual violence garnered national media attention from the Center for Public Integrity's investigative series entitled Sexual Assault on Campus, A Frustrating Search for Justice, which was featured by National Public Radio in 2010. In honor of her courage and contributions to the 2011 Title IX guidance, known as the Dear Colleague Letter, Vice President Joe Biden invited Dunn as a VIP guest to its release. In 2014, Dunn received a Juris Doctor from the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, where she graduated Order of the Barristers for her superior talents in trial and appellate advocacy, as a Rose Zetzer Fellow for her studies in the Women Leadership and Equality Program, and received the William P. Cunningham Award for her national work on campus sexual violence. This work included contributing to the 2000 Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, reauthorization, advising the White House Task Force to protect students against sexual assault, and serving as a primary negotiator on the U.S. Department of Education's VAWA Rulemaking Committee. To recognize her advocacy, then Chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Patrick Leahy, recognized Dunn on the floor of the U.S. Senate, and Vice President Biden invited her as a VIP guest to the signing of the 2013 VAWA reauthorization, as well as the release of the It's On Us campaign at the White House. While in law school, Dunn also interned at the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of Violence Against Women, served as a judicial intern for the 9th U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland, worked as a law clerk for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, and founded the national not-for-profit Serve Justice.
So I'm not going to finish the rest of that, but because there's probably about 30 seconds more of this, but I just wanted to point out, and actually French Honey Badger also pointed it out. So French Honey Badger's super chat is relevant here. He gave us $5 and said, her media citations are the who's who of cancer. So what I wanted to listen to this for, I mean, like, didn't you guys hear the mention of the right-wing media source that they had in there that had published her? Says neither did I. Like, it was all like the regressive, progressive, you know. And then the other aspect of this I wanted to mention is, what else has this woman done with her life? This is it, right? Her credentials are, these are all the ways in which this woman has made I'm a victim her profession. She literally is a professional victim.
That is so messed up. Who wants to live like that?
I don't know. But this just blows my mind. Like, can you imagine? Now, it's one thing, like, I can understand telling your story after it's happened. I can understand writing down what you learned from your story and sharing it with other people. And, and I can understand starting a study movement or an initiative to fix a problem, if there is a problem. That I can recognize. But this nationally recognized victim shit where she becomes, an advisor to everybody and their uncle because something happened to her, as if the fact that something happened to her that happens to a variety of people in a variety of ways, under a variety of circumstances, for a variety of reasons, suddenly she is an expert on all of them.
I also find it funny, people were pointing it out in chat, and I was thinking of it too. The uncle, or creepy Uncle Biden, I think somebody said. Yeah, it's hilarious because of all the stuff that he's been handsy with.
That he is either the most socially awkward famous person ever, or there is something really wrong with him. I can't argue with that. There's Joe Biden and his public behavior, like, just is questionable and strange and all, but I can't. I hate to say I can't put my finger on it in the midst of talking about, Biden, but it's hard to tell whether he's being genuinely creepy or whether he just doesn't know what to do with his hands. In other words, it's hard to tell whether he doesn't know what to do with his hands or he doesn't know what not to do with his hands. So I don't want to necessarily label him like that, but boy, I also would keep my distance if I was near him, stuck in the same room with him. And there's been men and women I've known that are like that. They just weren't famous. So, in any case, that litany of the professional victimhood accolades. And then the other thing is, Biden was, if I remember right, Biden's the one who introduced the Violence Against Women Act back in '94. Tells you how old he is. He was he was a senator at that time, and he's the one that brought it to the floor. We ought to do at some point a show on that. The Violence Against Women Act was introduced on the basis of complaints that there was no law in place to deal with the issues that it supposedly covers, but there was. The Family Violence Prevention or Protection and Services Act of 1984, signed by Ronald Reagan, that established shelters. It established a 24-hour hotline. It established guidance for law enforcement. All of the stuff that they said we needed VAWA for. And it took Mary Koss's convoluted, deliberately biased research to being heavily publicized too. First by Gloria Steinem's Ms. Magazine, and then more mainstream press to get VAWA passed. And Biden was the one that pushed it. So that's not surprising that it was Biden who contacted this professional victim and said, "Hey, come and be a featured guest at the let's show off our professional victims. Here's my staple of proxy victims for people to look at while we get this law passed that's going to be another attack on due process."
Okay.
So, yeah, let's see if I can read my numbers here. I'm going to skip to 4 minutes. Actually, no. It was 3 minutes.
Cases across the country. She is also a
2018
TED Fellow and delivered a TED Talk. Congratulations on your 6th year. I'm very impressed, and I hope that we get to come back next year.
And that's where she's accepting this
I want you all to be participants.
victimhood
So if you have a smartphone,
speech.
I am giving you some hints.
Yep.
Please go ahead and get out your Facebook, your Snapchat, your Instagram, and feel free to take pictures of this conference, of the setting, even of this presentation, and share. If you have questions that you think of in the middle of my presentation before the Q&A part, you can go ahead and post them. That way you can find them later, and definitely give a shout out to, again, Rowen University and Serve Justice. I'll be talking a lot about the work there. I have transitioned out, and I'll talk about that
but it is still doing great work on the issue of campus sexual assault. So please feel free, get involved, grab your phones.
At least here we have somebody who's not trying to hide what they're doing. You know,
yeah, that's promising.
It's one thing.
Oh yeah, no, she is very straightforward with what she thinks of things.
You know, I hate when you show up at a feminist talk and they say that you know, you're harassing them if you ask questions. Just saying.
A little bit about myself. You obviously heard my bio, and I never know if I'm going to get introduced or not, or if you'll know who I am or not. So I apologize if some of this is repeating, but I think it's important that you know where I've come from and where I'm going, and that's even the focus of the whole presentation. Where has the movement come from, and where is it going? And I, in many ways, am symbolic of the movement. I was a student survivor who experienced sexual assault as a freshman, like far too many of our students still experience. And I just happen to have a very unusual path. I honestly don't think it's something unique about me, other than right time, right place, and I had a calling. So I'm glad that I've been able to kind of see the movement come all the way through and be part of it. But there really was a day where I was like any other survivor that comes into your office and really didn't know which way to turn and what to do next. And I didn't report right away. A lot of people talk about how outspoken I've been. I was like every other survivor who didn't know what to call it, didn't know what to do, didn't know how to respond, and just tried to focus on being a student and a student athlete. And only when that became impossible did I decide to speak out. And I'm glad that some good has happened from it. And I thank the Center for Public Integrity and National Public Radio for really exposing the issue. And we'll talk about that when I get into the timeline about the movement. But that's really why I'm here today, is because of shattering the silence. There is still power in speaking out and demanding change.
Just want to point out that we are now 6 minutes and 30 seconds into this feminist victimhood talk. And so far, all we have is a self-inflating, self-proclaimed victim. Like, they've talked now for 6 minutes and 30 seconds about how great and how important this person's victimhood is.
God. What a thing to aspire to.
I know. And it's like, now, just for comparison, okay, when we have had people who have been victimized by false accusers come in and talk about their experiences at the men's rights conferences that I've attended, they come in and they give a very brief overview of the circumstances they were in prior to the abuse that they experienced. And this is true also with men who have experienced domestic abuse. They describe how they got there, but they're very brief. They don't need accolades for being terribly victimized. They go in and they say, you know, everything was this way, this is what I was doing up until this point, this is how I was living, this was the circumstance in which it began, and this is what happened. And they're very matter-of-fact about it. And we don't listen to, you know, we might get a few minutes of the accolades a person deserves if they are an expert being introduced, and they're going to talk about the topic of their expertise. This psychologist who has treated this particular type of abuse victim for years and years is going to talk about the characteristics of the abuser, the characteristics of the abuse, and this is all of the educational accolades he or she has, and this is all of the things he or she has done in the field that demonstrate that you should listen to what they're saying because they know what they're talking about. That's not this. This is, she's such a victim that it actually got the attention of Senator Joe Biden, king of the victims. Well,
he was vice president at the time.
That's true. At the time it was Vice President Joe Biden, so it's even worse. Vice President of Victims, call her into the illustrious victim office to help him figure out what to do with his hands. To be the victim of the day at the victimhood parade. I guess it bothers the hell out of me. You know, it's like they should be playing the Miss America theme song, but instead of here she is, you know, Miss America, it's here she is, Miss Victim of the Day, and it just I would be appalled to be introduced like that. You know, I would want to crawl under the table and not come back out and talk to everybody. I wouldn't want them looking at me like that. It would be very upsetting. So,
I mean, it just feels like, I don't know, that's not the sort of thing that I would ever want to showcase to other people if that was a thing that happened to me. Like, this is not something that I have done. It's not something like to be proud of. Like, it's maybe not necessarily something to be like ashamed of, right? Because obviously nobody ever asks for these things to happen to them. But at the same time, it's not something like to be proud of. If I want to go up and showcase something, it's because this is something that I've accomplished, or, you know, this is something that I have done for other people, not this is something that happened to me. Give me praise for it for some reason. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm all for people coming up and saying, hey, these are the things that happened and this is what you can learn from this experience. But it's a totally different story of...
Oh no.
What's the matter?
Oh no, Hannah?
Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go.
Alright. Can you guys on the show hear me?
We can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
It just... it did
you were just
like a fast-forward thing.
Yeah, the stream's offline too. No, it's my computer's doing something fucked up again, and I don't know what it is, but it's just lag. So...
Yeah, you want all robot voice?
Yeah, I'm gonna look and just double check. There's nobody home but me, so it's not like somebody's using internet. And
it's back online. It looks like.
Yeah,
or it's loading back up.
Yeah, it looks like the. Yeah, I'm lagging though on mine, so I'm gonna see if it's still. It's not my internet because you guys can hear.
Well,
me.
You do not sound robo voice to us now.
Well, that's good.
No.
Yeah, you cut out and then suddenly it was.
Yeah.
I always love when it does that. It's like it's trying to catch up.
Yeah, but yeah, everybody will have to need to reload the page, so I'm gonna actually type.
I saw a lot of Fs.
Yeah.
Pay respect to the stream.
Yeah.
Okay.
And General Stupidity says, "What? I can't hear you." Yeah, that was the problem. So now everybody knows honey badgers go down. I'm horrible, and I do it on purpose. Just saying. So since we've had this lovely interruption, it's probably because I was saying nasty things about Biden. You know, Uncle Sam doesn't like it when you talk dirt about Uncle Sam. But I'm going to go ahead, and we did have a couple of other super chats, and I'm going to get those in really quick before we go on. So Master Rogue gave us US $5 and said, Prim! And then he said, some good news and kind of interesting stuff. I'll tell you on Discord. So the rest of us don't get to hear it.
Yeah, it's very exclusive.
Very exclusive.
Yeah.
You forgot the hugging heart.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Hug, heart, smiley face, grin.
Yeah.
But that's all good.
We won't hold it against
you. Yeah. That's it. He's secretly advertising the Discord. And then Frenchinator 2 gave us US $2 and said, NPR funded public funded cancer, Joe Biden. Yeah, I have a habit of that, mispronouncing. But of course, you know, maybe it's just me simply recognizing Joe's V. So, in any case, let's get on with it. I had to go back to Discord to make sure I could hear you guys, so I'm scrambling with 50 windows in my tiny little screen here. And we're going to skip a little.
Just so happened, unserved justice. A lot
just
of
like
these
that.
Students that were activists themselves formed organizations, first just for students, and then became national nonprofits that still stand to this day, that I hope that you reach out to and use.
You know, here she's talking about students who were considered victimized, forming organizations for victims and stuff.
Yeah, serve justice is what she was specifically talking about.
This is where, like, the Take Back the Night shit started happening and everything, too.
The supports and resources. And of course now, I'm a lawyer, and yes, you may be on the wrong side of the lawsuit with me bringing the case, but I remember where I came from, and I promise you it would have been much better for my school to do the right thing than for me to have gone and had to take legal action. So it's my honor, honestly, to talk to institutions and try to encourage you to do the right thing, to care about survivors, to comply with federal law, and really treat everyone on all sides with dignity and respect. Because it would be much better if it goes right than if it has to go into legal action.
I should have got weepy music to play behind this.
And again,
yeah, so I wanted to respond, want to respond to this, because I guess there's the mentality these days that if somebody accuses somebody and that person that is the accused is not punished, something went wrong.
Yeah.
Like, I hate that attitude.
Well,
With
yeah.
the burning passion of 10 billion suns. Hate it.
It's like, oh, this is a miscarriage of justice. It's like,
right.
Well, how do you know? How do you know? Like, obviously there wasn't enough proof to prove that this person did that thing. So, I mean, he could have done it or he could have not, or she could have, if we're being equal, because it is equal that it could happen. But if there wasn't enough evidence, then I would rather let a couple of guilty people go than to convict an innocent person and ruin an innocent person's life. And that should be the standard. But no, now people are like, oh, we will scalp everybody that has an accusation thrown against them. And it's like, oh, this is such a bad precedent.
It's what's the statistic that they tried out? Like 2% of people that commit sexual assault or something actually go to jail, or something. I forget what the numbers are. But it's such
bullshit,
inaccurate statistic when you actually break everything down.
Oh, what they do is they presume all accusations true unless proved beyond a shadow of a doubt to be false. So, and therefore, anything that doesn't result in a conviction is an accusation that was mishandled, or a case that was mishandled. Well, that's not necessarily true. There are cases, and the other thing is, there are cases that do result in convictions, guilty pleas and so on, where it actually turns out that the accusation was false, and the person was railroaded, or they were bullied into a plea deal by the prosecuting attorney,
which happens a lot.
like Brian Banks was. I mean, what happened with Brian Banks was egregious. He was dragged into a room with the prosecutor to browbeat him and threaten him without his parents, no mother, no father, no nothing, no parental figure, no lawyer, no nothing. If I understand correctly, he didn't have any advisors at all. And they basically said, well, you're gonna have to do this. You're gonna have to plead guilty to this, because if you don't, you're gonna go to jail for 20 years. But if you do, we'll get you out after only 5 or 6. And he ended up losing a career. And of course, his accuser came back later and wanted to be friends and admitted that her accusation was a lie. And he happened to be able to get it recorded, but yeah, this is a situation where the statistics that they trot out are based just like all other feminist statistics.
She talks about the statistics later, and I'm pretty sure that you're gonna blow a gasket.
yeah. But that's okay, because I can handle gaskets. I got a big mouth. I got told that on Twitter not too long ago. You've got a big mouth. It's like, yep, that's right, and I'm gonna keep using it in ways you don't like, lady. But in any case, yeah, this idea that just because a conviction has occurred, that means that the action happened as the accuser said, is bullshit. And, the same thing is, there are people who are guilty who are acquitted. It happens. If there is not enough evidence, or if there is evidence that can be twisted, it happens. And it happens in all types of cases. It's not just something that happens in sexual violence cases. You can be acquitted of theft and be guilty of theft. You can be acquitted of shoplifting and be guilty of shoplifting, which is also theft. And of course, and of course,
good
just anything. I mean,
there.
yeah, you can be acquitted
convicted of redundancy
of taxation, which is also theft. There you go, French honey badger. But it's just because a result has happened does not mean that justice has been served. Justice, like I said in I think last week's opening monologue, justice isn't a result, the result that you get in the case. It is the process of seeking the truth of the matter, looking at all of the evidence, taking all of the logic that you encounter along the way, incorporating that into your decision-making process, making a reasoned, rational attempt at coming to a true conclusion, a factual conclusion, and then responding in proportion to what happened, what you find out. And that's what justice is. It's not acquittal, it's not conviction, it's not my side won, your side won. It's that process.
It's not the result you want.
And so anytime part of that process is taken away, anytime you take away the right to exculpatory evidence, to present exculpatory evidence, you take away the right to examine all of the evidence, you take away the right to cross-examine the accuser or the accused, you are interrupting the process of justice. And that is, at its base, the reason for charges like obstruction of justice, when you are withholding things from the court where justice is, the process of justice takes place. You are obstructing justice. And I see feminism as a massive effort to obstruct justice, not to obtain it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So we'll continue on listening. The next bit
to
that
this
she's
tripe.
What she's going to be talking about next for a while is the background of the movement.
Yeah, the background of the movement, which I think she's not much old. I don't think she's much older than me. She might even be younger than me. I can't.
No, she's she's much closer to my age. She graduated in 2003 or something. She's much closer to my age.
So she's talking about stuff that happened when I was in college. And I'm going to point out, like, you see stuff about Take Back the Night rallies on television. I think even, a lot of pop culture did portray these things, made it into what was popular at the time. I didn't watch a lot of TV, but I think it made it into Beverly Hills 90210. And it made it into, what was the other one? It was 21 Jump Street. I think it made it into, there were some, like, girly-ass soap operas about high school kids.
She graduated in 2007 with her BA. So she is not that much older than me.
Yeah,
I'm 25, so...
She's younger than me then. So she wasn't there for some of the stuff that she's going to be describing, and she may be describing it through the lens of
like
this is what's 30. Been presented to the public. A lot of it was a lot smaller, at least in my area.
Okay.
For instance, the chick that took me to the two Take Back the Night rallies that she took me to, the first one wasn't on my campus because there was no such thing going on my campus at the time. And the first campus I was on, like, if you'd have tried to tell the students there that this was going on and they needed to participate in it, they'd have been like, yeah, go someplace else. We don't want anything to do with that. We enjoy each other's company. Go away. And so it was really the schools that had already been infiltrated by feminist academia. So you'd see it more in the bigger state schools. And you'd see it in some of the Ivy League schools. You'd see it in the areas that they basically targeted. But eventually it did make it to... my campus was a satellite campus from a state college. The second one where I actually went to these two rallies. And the first one, like I said, wasn't even on my campus. It was at another university's campus. Then they decided to imitate it on my campus. And like 30 people showed up. So they show it when you see it in the old television shows that were aimed at kids, student-age kids, high school and college age. You'd see these university campuses with the entire square or whatever in between buildings where the students would hang out and stuff, just full of angry young women. And honestly, it's a lot more like the the movie PCU, where there's 12 angry feminists that are shouting bullshit out of all the other, or at all the other students, and all the other students just kind of ignore them as much as possible. So that's that's
Wow.
it. Yeah. So with that context, here's her talking about this background.
It's really important to remember that history does repeat itself. A lot of people said when the survivors were rallying on campus back in the day, this is just a hot news item today. It's going to go away. It's going to disappear. Enjoy it while it lasts. And obviously we know that's not true. We have seen the Me Too movement is still ongoing. And hopefully this is a movement that doesn't have to keep repeating itself, because we remember and we keep building, which is, again, what you all are doing here in your 6th year with this Title IX conference.
6 years.
Let's
6 years
talk
of
about
this.
The past of the movement. In my opinion, it started in 2010 in earnest, and obviously is still going to this day, even though it's evolving and changing. And I do want to kind of build in the theme of this, which is a very powerful theme of power, politics, and privilege. So we're going to play a little game. Name that shame. Which picture do you recognize? Does anyone remember any of these iconic images? I see a few people nodding yes.
She's going to say what they are in a minute.
Guess on one of them?
Yeah.
Since we can't see them.
On the bottom left, that is students rallying to support Paterno after the Penn State scandal broke. And a lot of people believe that he, in fact, knew and had hid
The Joe Paterno case?
decades of child sexual abuse. Those students are supporting him, not the survivors.
Now, here's something I want to... the Penn State thing. I want to get into this because there's been some stuff come out since then that has called this case into question. So he's in jail. He's in prison, and he's been living there ever since this happened. But there's been a book come out, and the book title
Jerry
is
Sandusky, not Joe Paterno.
Jerry Sandusky's in prison, but it was she wants to blame everybody she thought knew. So Sandusky's in sorry, I didn't clarify who I was talking about there, but The Most Hated Man in America, Jerry Sandusky and the Rest to Judgment is the name of this book, and I'm looking at some of the things that were described in this book. There was an interview. I'm gonna actually see if I can put this up in the window here. So, sorry guys, I'm about to drop it into the chat for no reason, because I'm transferring it from one computer to another. It's the easiest way for me to do that. But, and of course it's gonna open slow. But that's okay, because that actually just gives me time to open the window. Yeah, this is a slow process. OBS is fun to work with sometimes. So here's the open. Why the hell is it not?
Open sesame.
Yeah, I've just told it to come up, and it's like I've just told it to come up. It's not coming up. Frickin' hell. All right, let me try this. There we go. All right, I closed it and opened it back up again. So this is the story, and here is the book title in the screen. But what's significant about this is where he talks about this whole thing hinged on recovered memory. Now, to understand that, what's wrong with that? Recovered memory is a type of testimony that stems from the alleged victim having recalled things that they had supposedly buried or forgotten in their minds. This is, let's see if it gives him, if it gives a description of this. But they basically discovered that there is a serious problem with the interviewers leading the supposed victims through their recovery process. So instead of the victim, the alleged victim, having recovered memories of something that has gone wrong, they have planted memories of something that the interviewer wanted them to be able to testify. So I don't know if it's in this one or not. This is the one that is like I said, it's the interview with the author of the book. But
it's disgusting how many young women have been made to hate their once beloved fathers because of stuff like that. And it's like, oh, you were sexually molested your entire childhood, and you've just been repressing it this whole time.
Yeah, and that's, I can tell you one thing, even though, it was traumatic, I never forgot. There wasn't a moment in my life where I was walking around thinking it hadn't happened, or not thinking that it had, not knowing that it had. But here we have, let's see. Nope, that's not it either. I know there was a spot in here. Yeah, here it is. So the one accuser, Fisher, goes to this Clinton County psychologist, Mike Gilliam, who's absolutely sure from the beginning that Sandusky was an evil molester, because that's, one of many kinds. Although, actually, that's not funny, but it is, because they have to add these adjectives, like, it's not bad enough to call somebody a molester, you have to make it worse. So Gilliam denies that he practiced repressed memory therapy, but that is clearly what he did. He believed that Aaron didn't remember the abuse, and he needed to be educated about how the brain could dissociate or repress memories, which of course is pseudoscience. Gilliam was sure Sandusky fit the profile of a terrible pedophile, and he told Aaron Fisher that repeatedly until he believed him. Seems fairly clear that without Mike Gilliam going after Fisher, none of these abuse allegations would have happened. So that's the first thing. And then you had other accusers that had the same experience, where they had initially said, no, nothing happened, and then they talked to this interviewer, and they come out with repressed memories, and all of a sudden, now there's a whole bunch of accusers, and the thing about there being a whole bunch of accusers is 1,000 accusations doesn't make a person guilty. Evidence that the accusations are true can indicate that a person is guilty, but 1,000 accusations don't make a person guilty. And it doesn't matter if you go up to 1 million, it doesn't matter if you go up to 1 billion. Accusations are not proof of guilt, but they get treated as evidence of guilt. Under the kind of smoke fire theory.
It's kind of astounding how many people are like, oh yeah, well, I mean, there wouldn't be this many women accusing this person if it wasn't true. And it's like, well, I mean, okay, that's still not evidence, though. Like, what kind of evidence are these women presenting? Are they all presenting like the same evidence? Are they all presenting like different scenarios? There's many questions to ask about it. And just like saying, oh, you just don't believe women if you're just like questioning the fact that 50 women have come out of the woodwork. It's like, well, no, like, I mean, and we shouldn't just automatically believe them. That's not how it should work.
Where were the other 49 of these women before the first one came out?
Yeah,
that's I always wonder that.
Also relevant.
Yeah. And then you have, this isn't just the interviewer. First you have the interview process, with the individual asking leading questions and implanting memories that maybe aren't real. Then you have confirmation bias among the police. And so, as Pendergast here says, basically people conducting themselves with a presumption of guilt, they only consider evidence that supports their hypothesis. Police were not the least bit interested in children who said Sandusky was a great guy and he didn't abuse them. Officers made it clear to these young boys that they didn't believe them. So they only believe the people they're talking to if the people they're talking to claim to be victims. And they said, if you remember something at 3 in the morning, call us. They would cross-contaminate by saying things like, many other people said Sandusky has done this and this and this. How about you? Officers would make the young men feel they were failing, hiding, or lying if they didn't say Sandusky had abused them. So here you have a bunch of young men who have, you remember that Sandusky also worked with troubled boys. So you have a bunch of young men who have been through a program where they've learned to respect authority, and they've learned to trust authority, and in particular, like the police, their coaches, their father figures, and they've got a bunch of cops standing over them going, "We know this guy abused you. Why don't you just tell us?" And yeah, people who believe Sandusky is guilty will say, well, young boys are ashamed of having been involved, and they'll hide it. But the fact is, if you berate somebody into confessing that they were abused, you get false confessions. The same as if you berate somebody into confessing that they stole that candy bar from the convenience store.
Right.
Well, yeah, like, I mean...
You berate somebody into wanting to basically just end whatever they're going through.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, even when I was going through the abuse from my stepmother, I was berated into saying that I was lying when I tried to tell on her the one time. Like, it's really easy to do, especially if the person is in the right state of mind.
Yeah, they just want to end whatever they're going through, and if that's from somebody asking them questions, and they just want to get them out of their hair, pretty much, they'll say whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are, you know, this woman is using the Jerry Sandusky case, right, as fodder for her, you know, oh, this is such a valid thing that I'm doing, and this movement that I'm involved with is such a valid thing. The Jerry Sandusky case may have been, we don't know, because the evidence is very muddled and muddied. And we may not find out for years. It may be years before some of these boys come forward and say, you know, well, I was bullied into saying things that were not true about Jerry Sandusky. Or it may be years before some of them come forward and say, no, I just couldn't talk about this stuff until it was dragged out of me. And you know, we won't know for years, because they'll have to mature and grow and age and everything, and it may be not reported when they do speak up, especially if they speak out against the status quo. So all this idea that cases like the Jerry Sandusky case are a statement on the validity of the Me Too movement, that just hits home really hard on the point that the Me Too movement is a problem in and of itself. Not because victims are speaking up, not because it's coming out into the open that maybe this is happening to the same person over and over again, or maybe it's happening more than people think, and maybe that there's things like, you know, people in positions of power are more likely to be able to do it successfully for a long period of time. But no, none of that is the problem. The problem is that when an accusation is false, the rush to judgment leads to victimizing the falsely accused, and we don't have a social mechanism for preventing that. We at least have a social mechanism for responding to the dangers of not dealing with predators, as long as it's, you know, sexual predators or financial predators. We don't have a social mechanism for dealing with the dangers of not dealing with social predators. And that's what this situation is.
And not to mention, like, people behave like, oh, you know, women get dismissed so easily all the time. And it's like, well, you know, history has kind of shown otherwise. Yeah. Like, look at people who were, like, lynched because women said, oh, this terrible thing happened to me. Like, it's... We're not predisposed to not believe and not support women. Like, I don't know. There have been, sure, some people will question a scenario, but I think that's the right thing to do. Like, we want to try and get all of the evidence for what happened in a scenario to try and get a clearer picture of what went on. But some people are kind of mistakenly confusing this with victim blaming or, you know, non-victim supporting, and it's just like we've gotten a really warped idea of what it looks like to support people who are going through something traumatic, right? And in doing this, we are not only, like, we're not just supporting people who have gone through something traumatic. We might also be supporting traumatic things being done to people who have done nothing wrong.
Right,
That's the problem.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And the trauma of being falsely accused is just unbelievable. I went over that, and I think in our last show a little bit too. And it's one of those things that if you haven't seen somebody go through it, you have no idea how bad it could be. You know, if somebody talks about somebody getting third-degree burns, everybody's sympathy comes from they have at least an idea of the fact that it's an intensely painful, physically damaging, life-threatening experience. But they don't have, if you haven't witnessed or experienced a false allegation of a serious nature, you don't have any context by which to judge the potential experiences of the individual that has. And so people don't have the same level of sympathy, and they do need support networks, and they need a defense, and they deserve one.
Absolutely, and not to mention the range of experiences that somebody who's falsely accused can go through is also quite varied. Like, if people believe that the falsely accused was guilty of the crime that they're falsely accused of, then they can very quickly lose all of their supports. And like that can look very different to somebody who is falsely accused, but their close friends and family believe them and who support them through the process of trying to go through trial or whatever else happens, right?
Right.
So like there's a wide range of experiences, and plus, not to mention, the mental health of all of these individuals can be very different, and their reactions to what they can do. Like, some can shut down and close themselves inwards and become, very reclusive, and other people can, reach out to all those people who are still supporting them and try and maintain some grip on their reality. And this can also come with, fake restraining orders that make things very difficult for them to get around, and all kinds of terrible rumors swirling around about them. So it's not
jobs.
just
it can cost. Most of the time when a false allegation is made against a person, it's not made by a stranger. It's made by somebody they know. You hear all the time that the majority of sexual violence is committed by someone close to the victim. Well, the majority of false allegations are also made by somebody close to the victim. They happen at work, they happen in families, they happen in church communities, they happen in school communities. It's usually someone with whom you have mutual friends, and sometimes even someone with whom you have mutual family, someone you're related to, and who's in the area they have, or someone who's an in-law, and in the area they may have a lot of family that's been close to them that's not as close to you, that you have to deal with at reunions, that you have to deal with at family Christmas and all of that. You may have to be on the same campus with your false accuser. You have to maybe be in the same workplace with your false accuser. You may have to run around the same town as your false accuser for years and years. And this is something that people don't take into consideration either. You know this person's out there, and this person's done this thing to you, and they could do it again at any time because you've seen them go through the system with no repercussions. And not everybody is able to get the result that, my friend that went through the 7 years in hell experience, that experience resulted in a finding of vexatious litigation. And that doesn't happen for everybody.
Well, yeah, not only that, but the person who falsely accused you might be getting all kinds of crazy support from the people around them, right? So how does that have to make you feel?
Yeah, like, Mark Pearson's accuser got money. She got paid. She got paid for dragging him through the court system. She got paid for trying to wreck his life and sending him through that traumatic experience, forcing him to go through the investigation, ruining his reputation. She got paid for that.
Yeah, what kind of awful gaslighting effect does that have to have on a person? What is that going to do to somebody's mental health, right?
So here we are looking at this case, this idea of, this is representative, this is this talk demonstrates the importance and validity of the Me Too movement. Well, you know what? Yeah, it does. It's questionable, just like the Sandusky case is questionable. And it's a very serious problem. The fact that we are in the throes of the next witch hunt, the next point the finger and somebody gets burned at the stake frenzy in society. You would think we would be done with that. You would think that after centuries of, at the end of each point the finger and somebody gets burned at the stake frenzy, when we are looking back going, gosh, how did we get into that situation? You would think humanity would have learned, hey, this pattern of behavior is stupid. We should rely on solid evidence and solid techniques for actually investigating that evidence and the case itself before we do things to people as punishment for accusations. But nope, we're still doing it. Hashtag me too. So, but on with this woman's little history of how feminism wrecked due process.
Bottom right corner, UConn's president, who came out and said that the activists who were speaking out, who were filing complaints and eventually won in court more than $1 million, were quote unquote misguided and didn't know what they're talking about. So that used to be the message that universities would take. I think universities have come a long way in trying to say we take this issue seriously and embracing it, but back in the day, it was very much an offensive message. And then on top, it might be hard to see, those are the students rallying at Tufts University, which had numerous Title IX complaints and at one point went out of compliance with a voluntary resolution agreement with the Office for Civil Rights. And a lot of us student activists were hoping that it was going to be the first school to ever lose federal funding for not complying with Title IX. So that's the background, that's the past. It wasn't...
Just a real quick note. What she just said was, students were hoping their school would lose federal funding for being out of compliance with a law.
That would mean that they can't get money from the government to go there.
Yeah, students were hoping their school would lose federal funding for not complying with changes to Title IX. And these are the changes to Title IX that are attacks on due process. That, I mean, when you're trying to tear down your own house because you're angry, you have a problem.
Great. And that's why we needed student activism that started arising in 2010. So in my opinion, one of the big things that happened in 2010 to kick off the movement really was the Center for Public Integrity. There had never been journalistic investigations or reviews of campus sexual assaults. We see them every day now, and we've seen them every day for years, but really it was never discussed, it was never researched, and it really came down to the Center for Public Integrity in partnership with National Public Radio to investigate. And I had the honor of being one of the few survivors chosen for that series, and it came at an odd time in my life. I had reported being sexually assaulted back in 2004 when I was finishing kind of my junior year or so in 2006, and it didn't go well for me. I'll give you the Cliff Note version because I'm not here to talk about myself as a survivor as much as this movement overall. But as a favor to the Center for Public, as a favor for the Security Center, Security on Campus. It's not the Cleary Center for Security on Campus. They've changed their name. But as a favor to them, I decided to speak to this journalist, and I was one of the only survivors that used my full name and my face and put it all on the line. Because not that long ago, people were Jane Does, and they definitely didn't show their face because there was this idea of shame. And it really was at the encouragement of my family to say, show people there's no shame, that I went all in and was able to be featured in the series. And it went on to win tons of awards. This is just one, the Dart Award for investigative series on trauma, and they haven't used my image. It's weird to be on an award you didn't get, but they have that in their office now to remember that series. And it really made a splash, and it got the attention of the Obama administration, who had already been petitioned by a lot of advocacy groups to do more about campus sexual assault. The 2001 Title IX guidance is about harassment. I hope you all have read it, you have a copy of it. It talks about harassment, not specifically assault. And so advocates were really pushing about assault because so many schools were leading that to the criminal system and putting it in a different category and really kind of avoiding their obligations under Title IX. So because this new series was blowing up the scene, getting all these awards, it got a Kennedy Award for Human Rights, it got a Peabody Award, it was just really making waves. And so the Obama administration paid attention and started having discussions with people like me about how to make Title IX better. And of course, they took action in 2011. So if you're not familiar, the top right, that's former Secretary of Civil Rights Ruslan Ali, who penned the 2011 Dear Colleague letter that has infamously now been rescinded. And of course, Vice President Biden was present at the release, speaking on behalf of his office and in tandem with Secretary Arne Duncan during the release. So we have to remember what was happening socially around that time. The Penn State scandal did break around the same time that this all was happening. And I think that was the first time for lots of people to understand really how deep this goes. A lot of people blow off one survivor, one woman making some complaint somewhere. It's hard to blow off decades of child sexual abuse that was known, that was covered up, that was discussed.
So here we have it again, the if there's smoke, there's fire argument. And it is coming out now that what she just said there may not be true.
Yep.
And they're once again, we will see feminists doing this. Like, if it comes out in 5, 10, 15 years, you know, that these kids were all heckled and bullied into remembering things, quote, remembering, you know, that didn't happen, or remembering things differently than they did happen. You know, the coach came in and said, hurry up and get done with that shower. I want to go home and I can't leave until you do. And turns into coach came in and grabbed my butt, you know, something like that. That comes out 5, 10, 15 years down the line. Feminists are going to still continue talking about there was this abuse, except for this one kid. There was this abuse, and everybody knew, which they don't have evidence of. They don't have evidence that it was discussed and that everybody knew about it. They have evidence that one janitor told a story one time, and somebody didn't believe him. They don't have evidence that a bunch of kids complained to the administration and the administration did nothing. They don't have evidence that anybody had conversations about this. They don't have evidence that there were rumors floating around. They have one janitor said something one time, and he might have had reason to resent the coach. So that's kind of, once again, not indicative of a very good level of credibility in the Me Too movement when they rely on things like this as proof of their validity.
But don't you know, it started a conversation, Hannah.
Oh, God.
Isn't that always the excuse? We did something terrible and stupid, and we're getting called out on the carpet for it now and criticized for our behavior now. But, you know, our excuse is, I was only pretending to be I mean, I was trying to start a conversation.
Wow.
Geez. Yeah, so we'll listen to some more of the drivel.
But the way, even with police involvement, not taken seriously. So really, I think the U.S. started to see there is something unique about campuses in the way, at that time, that they were protecting and insulating and allowing perpetual harm to occur. And of course, we had famous Title IX complaints like the one at Yale, and Alexander Brodsky, who went on to found Know Your Nine, and is now a fellow at the National Women's Law Center, having graduated Yale's law school, went and filed a complaint with several other students. And some of you maybe remember that scandal. A bunch of fraternity members were going on campus, I believe outside like the Women's Resource Center and the female dorm, saying that no means yes and yes means anal, and chanting that, and had done it every year to create a hostile environment on that campus. And Yale had kind of blew it off and shrugged and let it be a tradition. So there were a lot of really big stories that were starting to make headway, and of course the department added its voice. And this was a commitment from the Obama administration, right? The same commitment that those who are on the due process and or accused rights side claim changed the game too far.
So here we have the demonization of people who actually want to inject some common sense into this. Oh, if you're for due process, you hate women. If you're for due process, you're just, you know, saying there's too much help for women. And I mean, she's still got the who's who of regressive nonsense people coming out of her mouth, too. It's like diarrhea.
This is exactly what I was complaining about before, because, you know, like what I was saying earlier, people will just take that and say, oh, it's just because you hate women or because you want to blame the victim. And it's like, no, I'm just trying to seek the truth of the situation, for crying out loud. Just because she is female does not mean 100% of the time that she's a victim. And just because she's saying she's a victim doesn't mean that she's a victim. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to go around saying, oh, you know, you're probably just lying about it. And nobody does that, for crying out loud. They act like that's the way we treat people before this listen and believe nonsense. But that's not the way it was. We can treat people like, you know, we can be supportive without necessarily believing everything until we find all of the evidence.
Well, and you also, you notice what she's doing. She's stringing together a bunch of things, some of which may be legitimate, and some of which are not, and some of which are outright stupid, like taking a joke as a serious thing and claiming that it creates a hostile environment on campus. Because, hell, when I was in college, at the very conservative campus, okay, my most
there we
comfortable.
Go. Press F.
For fuck's sake. Okay, so you guys can't hear me, but that doesn't necessarily mean nobody else can. So I'm gonna...
Wait, we can hear you. We can hear you. We can hear you.
Well, anyway, so when I was in college, my most comfortable and prettiest bra was stolen out of the laundry. I walked out of the laundry room for like 10 minutes, come back in, the laundry was still drying.
Is the video going all crazy for you?
Yeah, I'm hearing both Hannah and the live stream. Or
That's bizarre. Because nothing... I'm not broadcasting the live stream.
Oh my gosh.
It's...
Okay,
there's literally nothing
do you hear the audio?
No.
Oh my
I hear
gosh.
nothing but you guys.
That's hilarious.
The audio on the side tube keeps starting.
It shouldn't.
It's
okay. It's
for me.
It's not playing on my.
I'm pausing it, and then it gets unpaused.
All right. I just unpaused it and paused it. Did it stop for you guys?
No.
Okay.
It's going for me still.
Well, what?
Hit pause.
I don't know what the hell's going on.
I'll let you hit the pause button.
All right. Let me try it again.
Actually enforce.
All right. Well, all right. Now how is it? Because nobody else can hear this. It's not going through my computer. It's going through your guys' computers.
That's so weird. It's totally still playing for me.
Okay.
Yeah, it's at like 1622, 1624.
Really? Because it should be at 1452 at this point.
No!
All right, reload that. Reload SciTube.
Okay, let's try that.
So you guys are having technical difficulties, but I'm not.
No, even when I refresh it, it starts playing again.
Well, for fuck's sake, I wonder why that's doing that.
It wouldn't be an HBR show without technical difficulties.
Well, this is just SciTube being weird.
There shouldn't be any problem.
Right. How about remove the video and then re-edit?
There we go. It stopped.
No. All right.
Wait. Oh, wait. Yeah, it's at 1453.
Nice.
Right.
There we go.
So it should be.
That was so strange.
Yeah. We're gonna go back about 10 seconds on it because I've hit it twice, and we're probably gonna hear the same thing all over again. So we're talking about my stolen bra. This was all was well on my end. I don't understand what happened with you guys, but I think I fixed it. Okay. In any case,
yeah, we're good.
So that said, that was a joke, and then I knew who stole it because they put it on a yardstick and they hung it out the window of one of the men's dormitories. So
Nice.
now I didn't complain about this because the moment I spoke up to complain about it, somebody would have been like, "Oh, you slept with that guy," and I didn't sleep with him, so I didn't want people thinking I did. And as it was, at that point, I'd been hanging out in the weather and everything, and I'm like, all right, I went and got a new bra. It was not exactly like it wasn't exactly like a big deal. It wasn't earth-shattering. I didn't feel like my life was wrecked.
You weren't super victimized.
My two best friends at the time thought it was the most hilarious thing in the entire world, and of course everybody was more vigilant in the laundry room after that. And the funniest part of it was, when I was in college, I was so flat-chested that at one point my mother saw a picture that had me topless in the background that didn't have my face in it, and she said, "Who's that guy?"
Wow.
So I had dorm mates with double D's, and they took the double A cup.
Oh, wow.
And this was like, we all thought this was hilarious. This woman comes from a place, an attitude, where that was an atrocity. That was like, oh, she would never be the same, and it was part of a rape culture that obviously, they're entitled to women's bodies and blah blah blah. You know what? None of the guys from that dormitory ever directly did anything to me. Not anything annoying, not anything upsetting, not anything dangerous. The worst thing that I think those guys did was they made a water balloon launcher. They made a water balloon launcher, and they would launch the water balloons over another building. Another childish prank, right? Into a square where people walked through to get to class and everything. So you might be walking along to class and get hit with a water balloon that looked like it came out of nowhere. Just fell on you from the sky. And that was it. Like, they were just ornery guys. And there was no rape. There was no sexual assault. There was no sexual harassment. There was just college like kids being college kids.
Pranks aren't the same as rape and stuff. Yeah. Who knew?
And I mean, at least that was innocent. When I was in junior high, one of the girls in my class threw a tampon into the boys' locker room, just to scare the crap out of all the guys. Well, that was not
hopefully
quite
not
so,
a used one.
Yeah.
Biological
warfare. But still, biological warfare. And of course, the guys all come running out.
Well, I mean, shit. If a girl threw a used tampon in the ladies' room, I would still be running out, being like, "Ugh,
oh yeah, if that happened today, there would be today there would be parents calling for jail time. I would be one of them. I'm sorry, but you can't do something like that. Back then, like, we're talking, 1985. AIDS wasn't even. People didn't know what caused it necessarily. People, as in like the layman, didn't know what caused it. You had the medical community fully aware, but the idea of a biohazard wasn't the same in 1985 as it is now. And so a kid back then didn't have maybe the same culpability for knowing about biohazards as a junior high school student today might. But in any case, the difference in the communities there, where I went to school and the way things were and how we dealt with things, we played pranks back and forth, and that university, actually, pranks were a thing. And my dad had classmates that took a cow up the stairs in one of the dormitories and they couldn't get it back down. Because cows, you can lead a cow upstairs, but cows do not know how to parse going down the stairs. They can't see it properly. So
I've heard that.
They had to call the fire department to get the cow out of the dormitory. Same thing happened that one time with Amy Schumer. Anyway. So this idea of stringing all these things together, right? Stuff that you absolutely should never in a million years take seriously, with stuff that is absolutely 100% fake, and stuff that is absolutely 100% real and very serious, and something that should be dealt with immediately and very carefully. Stringing it all together like that to inflate these things and make it look like there's an epidemic of very serious immediate threats, you know, to your community that have to be dealt with immediately and very, very carefully and very meticulously. That is one of the key elements to the witch hunt.
The removal of shades of gray.
The removal of shades of gray. The removal of due process rights. The removal of common sense. The removal of investigation. And the substitution of immediate response. That is how you end up with kids in a courtroom sticking themselves with pins going, that woman is bewitching me, and the next thing you know, she's being hanged in a public square. And that is what is happening to men today. And that is where it is taking place, in university campuses, in college tribunals, where you have women going, that man right there. You know, he's eye raping me right now. My skin is going to crawl off because he's looking at me. Do something. And you know, he's out of school. His lynching is, you can't have an education. You can't have a career path. And your reputation is ruined permanently.
Back to the video.
And back to the audio of the crazy woman.
And that those who are on the due process and or accused rights side claim changed the game too far by making a commitment to actually enforce this law. Title IX was not enforced like it used to be. I should know, I filed the Title IX complaint as a survivor, and nothing happened.
We had no idea she was a survivor.
Very meaningless, and at the time I filed it, there were only about
she'd been calling herself a victim this whole time.
In the last decade. No one knew about it, no one used it. It rarely meant anything. So it was a really big deal for the department to speak out. It's very few people know that in the background, legislative action was starting to form, called the Campus Safe Blueprint. We knew the 2011 guidance was guidance, not law. And we knew that that was risky all the way back in 2011. So the day that I read the Dear Colleague letter, April 4th, 2011, I started working with advocates to make legislative change that would last the test of time. And of course, we know what happened after the Dear Colleague letter. Hopefully no one has forgotten, but we went and saw a giant wave of student activism. Students everywhere started reading this guidance, realizing they had rights, and started taking action on that. And
reading the guidance, realizing they had what?
Rights.
You don't have a right to a conviction. You have a right to have your accusation considered. You don't have a right to railroad somebody.
Yeah, and I just love how she's been using the words like victim and survivor as it suits her, as it's best going to help her spin the narrative.
Yeah.
One of the things that she just gave away there that she doesn't probably realize is the fact that all of the news coverage around the Title IX guidance, the Dear Colleague letter, all of the promotion of the victim narrative brought forward people who were more willing to accuse because they knew that evidence wasn't going to be required to support their accusation.
They're probably gender studies majors.
Well, the thing is, if you're accusing, only accusing because evidence isn't required to back your accusation, if you're only accusing because you don't have to prove what you're saying, how do we know that you're not a false accuser? How do we know that you're not lying? If we're just supposed to automatically believe you could say anything, how do we know if you're not lying, that you're not lying? And so what she just admitted there was that the Dear Colleague letter probably significantly increased the number of false accusations on university campus. That if you reduce the standards for evidence, if you eliminate several aspects of due process from the process, you are going to increase the number of false accusations. So,
especially if there's not a lot of punishments or any for false accusation.
Right. And if you if you have that situation going on, you know, you're going to increase the number of lawsuits, due process lawsuits. So what she basically admitted there is that the Dear Colleague letter is 100% responsible for the situation that we are experiencing now, and it is 100% responsible for the backlash. Oh, they say we went too far. Well, yeah, you went too far. You went You went from universities aren't doing anything, which isn't necessarily true, but the idea that universities weren't doing anything about a problem on campus, which of course feminists are saying was a bigger problem than it actually was, and then you go to universities aren't doing anything about another problem on their campus now, because they are doing something as if there's a problem that isn't as it's described by feminists. So they're overreacting, and they're essentially throwing one sex under the bus for the benefit, the perceived benefit of the other, and they are destroying the credibility of their campus system. But, you know, they didn't go too far.
I will talk about like where the specific photo comes from, but it really sums up this idea that students themselves, not some national nonprofit, not some organized entity, but students all across the country started communicating with each other online. It was called the Title IX Network. We started connecting up and sharing information of here's the Dear Colleague letter, here's the email for OCR, here's a journalist that will actually share that story, and oh, here's another survivor on your same campus. And so it went from individual students to groups of students filing massive amounts of complaints, and those 33 complaints that were filed when I was first speaking out now became over 300, because that's how many survivors and activists started getting involved in using that Dear Colleague letter. So it really was a grassroots-led movement.
Tacit admission there. I don't think she realized she did it. Activists who make Title IX complaints aren't necessarily survivors.
That grew out of that moment. And so we moved on to 2012, and we started to see Congress starting to get involved. We still saw major news stories breaking, and again, this was still rare. There weren't a ton of stories where survivors put their name on it. And so it got a lot of attention. Angie Epifano and Dana Bolger both were at Amherst College and spoke out. And for those who don't remember, Angie Epifano had reported campus sexual assault and was so mistreated that at some point she was forced into psychiatric hospitalization rather than being treated with dignity and respect. And so she had written a piece that was published, again, full name, face, for the rest of her life. Everyone will know this has happened to her. And she showed a very big level of courage to call out that university. And to the university's credit, they actually responded positively. And I know Gina Misto-Smith was presenting earlier today. She was involved and was brought into the school to try to handle that appropriately. And I remember that they're one of the few schools I point to as saying they've actually handled it well. They had a day of silence. They had a Friday where they allowed students to kind of sit and assemble and give information and feedback to the school. And so rather than defending, like UConn, and then being embarrassed when they lost the lawsuit, they decided to actually embrace their students, to embrace survivors, to hear what they hadn't done correctly, and to try to make amends and a change and a commitment. They redid their culture rather than double down.
It's almost like if you don't take an adversarial role towards your attitude towards your school, and you just ask them to deal with the problem, they make an effort to fix things.
Gasp.
Surprising.
Shock horror.
On what they did wrong. And as I mentioned, Congress started getting involved.
Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to point out. She mentioned Amherst. Amherst was where the accusation took place from a student who was embarrassed that she had molested her roommate's drunk boyfriend when he was blackout drunk.
Yeah.
And so she accused him of sexual assault and got him kicked out of campus 2 years later.
Yeah, and then didn't he found out that he was basically assaulted because he was blackout or like passed out drunk.
Yep, that is how he found out that she had molested him. He had no memory of it. He didn't know. He was blackout drunk, and comes to find out that
passed out, but because there's a difference.
Yeah, no, it was, my understanding is he was blackout drunk. He didn't know what was going on at the time, and so, but, and it's apparently she had said he was extremely drunk in some of the texts as well. So this was not just he was blackout drunk, but he was also extremely drunk.
And she knew that he was,
unable to appraise your actions drunk. And yeah, she knew. And
right. Yeah.
So
there's so many cases to keep track of.
I know. It's just insane. And this student got this guy kicked out of school to protect her ass because she committed a rape. And here she's mentioning this school as somebody who has wronged a female student. Well, that same school, unless it's a different Amherst, because I know there's also an Amherst here in Ohio, but
yeah, I don't know.
In any case, that if it's the same school, obviously maybe they just don't handle those cases well at all. But the idea that it was, just something that happens to a female is bullshit. And we're going to go on for a little more here, and then I think at the next place we stop this at, we're going to stop it for the night. I will go ahead and finish the super chats after that, but we'll hear the next thing she has to say.
Yeah, we can. There's a nice section where she talks about the Campus Safe Blueprint and VAWA.
Yeah.
Oh, bubbly.
So that Campus Safe Blueprint that was starting to develop became formally the Campus Save Act, or the Sexual Violence Elimination Act. Some of you may know it, may reference it. It evolved from the Safe Blueprint to the Save Act to VAWA, and is now part of the Clery Act. So it's a long kind of path with a bunch of legal names that us lawyers
VAWA made it part of the Clery Act.
It really was pushing the envelope and saying those key provisions of the guidance aren't just going to be in guidance, they're actually going to exist under federal law, under a statute. And they got incorporated into the Violence Against Women Act in 2012. Now, some of you may not be very familiar with VAWA. The Violence Against Women Act was an amazing piece of legislation that passed and was signed into
amazing!
Oh, God.
And it was the first time the federal government really made a strong commitment to ending violence against women, focused largely on domestic violence. It passed pretty much unanimously every single time it was reauthorized until 2012. This is the first year it died in Congress. It did not get reauthorized. That's because we had seen a rise of political change. The Tea Party actually had taken control of the House, and legislation that cared about women and violence against women and expanded federal power to address it was not popular within that new political scene.
So that's not entirely true either. They simply looked at the legislation and it didn't protect women, it protected feminism. Just saying, some things to understand about the Violence Against Women Act. Like I said, there wasn't any of the things that feminists say the Violence Against Women Act was really needed for. They were all present in the Family Violence Protection and Services Act of 1984. Shelters, hotlines, and the guidance for law enforcement and the courts to treat domestic violence as violence, just the same as if it had happened between strangers in a bar instead of between families in a house. The changes that took place in the Violence Against Women Act, and what that changed in the law was, instead of police simply treating domestic violence the same as any other violence, they now had to take it more seriously than other violence, and they only had to take seriously the potential danger to the woman. It brought out mandatory arrest policies, so if somebody makes a domestic violence call to the police because their neighbors are too loud, there's less opportunity for the cops to go in, evaluate the situation, and say, oh gosh, they were just having sex, and not arrest somebody. Or, oh gosh, they were just arguing loudly, and not arrest somebody. or you know, oh gosh, they were just watching a movie, and not arrest somebody. So that was part of the problem. And then as it went, they fought really hard to make that mandatory arrest policy: arrest the guy, don't arrest the woman. And so you ended up in a situation where if a guy is assaulted by his female partner, all of a sudden, if he reports that assault, he is now in danger of being arrested. And that's like that destroyed men's ability to get any help if they were abused. And before the Violence Against Women Act, those shelters that were formed as a result of VPSA, those shelters accepted both sexes. After the Violence Against Women Act passed, what actually changed there is that the shelters had to kick out all the men and all the boys over the age of 12. So now if a man is abused, he doesn't have any place to go. If an abused woman has children and any of them are male and teenagers, she can't take them and go, or she has to find someplace else for her son to stay, so she can get out of this situation. It actually caused a lot of problems. And then the other thing that it did was funded research on the problem of domestic violence done at those shelters that no longer accept male victims, so that they could have these numbers that would come from these shelters to prove that women are the people who experience domestic violence and men are the perpetrators. Because, of course, they've excluded all of the male victims, and there's no information coming in about female perpetrators. And last but not least, all of these women that make these accusations now have a state-funded advocate, besides the prosecuting attorney, who goes into court with them and is there to remind the court that, no, you can't hold this woman accountable if she commits perjury in the course of making these accusations, and is there to generally give the accused a rough time and any supporters that show up for him in court, and accuse them all of harassing the victim by just being there. We were told, during the 7 Years in Hell case, we were told that the accuser felt intimidated and felt that we were deliberately harassing her with our eyeballs by sitting in the courtroom and facing the judge. We were sitting behind his side, not her side, and we were asked to turn to face away from her so she didn't feel stared at.
Jeez.
Like, that's what these advocates for the victims do. And that's what the Violence Against Women Act was all about. It's created guidance for the court system, guidance for the prosecuting attorneys, guidance for police and everything. It's all based on the Duluth model, which has been disavowed by one of its own creators, that portrays men as guilty until and even if proven innocent, that that treats all all forms of marital strife and conflict as a patriarchal attempt by the husband to exercise power over the wife, and that treats women as completely powerless and incapable of abusing in return. So the idea that VAWA was something great, it's exactly the opposite. VAWA was Congress, trying to fart and discovering it was wet.
Nicely phrased.
But I think with that, we're going to stop. We're at 1950. It was a very good year. Unless, well, we're also at 9:54 p.m. Eastern, so yep. I got to go back and find. Yeah, we've really got a
sticky note.
Yeah, so I'm gonna pause it at 1950, and we will return in the next show. And continue. I think we may be going through this woman's so full of shit that it may fill up 2 or 3 shows here. We're
Oh
only
god, yeah, no.
we're
to a bunch of
I
we're
don't know
gonna
how
be
much you,
stuck with her for a while.
Much
I
to
don't
a
know how
bunch
much
of
you
people's disdain
read,
in the.
but there's
the
some
chat.
shit that she says that we can expand on a lot.
Yeah.
Especially when she talks about the Equal Amendment Act, the
Equal Rights Amendment?
Equal Rights Amendment, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've said before, and I'll say it again, the Equal Rights Amendment is a power grab. We already have an amendment that bans discrimination. It bans the government from discriminating on the basis of demographic characteristics, basically. Physical demographic characteristics. Race, religion. It's been determined in court that it also is about sex. The government is banned from sex discrimination. So the Equal Rights Amendment isn't about stopping the government from discriminating. It's about giving the government the power to use accusations of discrimination against businesses. And that's a bad precedent to set, because it starts making the government the arbiter of relationships between business and consumer in ways that it really should not be. But we can get into that when it comes up.
And she also celebrates the judge that was recalled in the Brock Turner case.
Oh yeah, I will have all kinds of things to say about that.
Yep.
I read extensively into that case, and also I happen to live in the Dayton metro area, and Turner returned home to the Dayton metro area, and people brought guns into his neighborhood that can shoot through brick and mortar to protest his ability to return home to his family. So after they protested, you know, the whole thing is just insane. So we'll get into that next week, or at least whatever we reach next week. But with that, I'm going to go back to, we are at, okay, so the last one I think I read was Joe Biden.
Yes.
Frenchinator 2 gave us $2 and said, the wrong side, so listen and believe. F you cunts. And that was actually at because you can't say cunts, apparently. And then Frenchinator 2 gave us another $2 and said, hashtag me too, say hi to Moral Panic, best of friends. And, you know, this is another one we really could probably do a whole show on the process of entering a moral panic. And you know, there's a lot of them that we could look at. Then, you know, you go back to the Salem, everybody goes back to the Salem witch trials and in the McCarthy era, but there have been others. So, the daycare panic was one that sort of gets glossed over because nobody wants to have sympathy for pedophiles. But the thing is, the reason it was a panic was because there were no pedophiles, and not involved in that situation. I mean, obviously pedophiles exist, but that situation was not a response to pedophilia. It was a response to pedohysteria. So then we have Hoki Bukisa gave us $10 and said, I think it is something to be ashamed of to trumpet your victim status. And I agree with that. Someone proud to call themselves a survivor should be ashamed. Now, I would be proud of surviving something that you had to fight to survive. Like, this person tries to kill you and you fight back and win. You know, you can be proud of that because you won. You had a battle and you won. But being able to say that you went through something and you were strong enough to deal with the pain and suffering that went along with it, and it didn't defeat you, and you're not defeated, that's something to be proud of. But to say, just to be proud of having experienced something awful in and of itself, that's a different story. And I think that's where feminism really screws up the pride of the survival instinct and the survival habit, is that they aren't proud of overcoming adversity. They're proud of having been targeted with it, or being able to say they were targeted with it. It's a status symbol, and that's a totally different story. And there's where I agree with Hoki Bukisa. It's shameful to wallow in victimhood.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily shameful to feel accomplished because you overcame victimhood, but it is shameful to wallow in it. And with that, since we do not have any other super chats, I am going to thank everybody for listening and putting up with Laura dun 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 the keynote speaker. I'm going to have to find the dun-dun-dun music now. But the keynote speaker of the
I don't know what
conference.
notes it would be on the horn, because I have my French horn out. But
I've got it somewhere. Actually, it would be dun-dun-dun! And I'd like to thank everybody that was involved in the making of Honey Badger Radio, everybody that has worked in the background to make sure that this could happen. And thanks for putting up with our technical difficulties. This time it wasn't just me. And with that, good night, everybody.